Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Today we're going to be speaking about atheism. Now, the Muslim civilization has faced many calamities and challenges, opponents throughout history. The early Muslims, the Sahaba, they faced the might of the Romans, the fierce opposition of the Persians, the onslaught of the Mongols, and the further onslaught of crusades. And later on in Islamic history, we had colonization, massive colonization of the Muslim world. So the Muslim world has gone through massive transformation because of the opponents that it's encountered. Now, something we don't really think about is that atheism, or in particular militant atheism, is something which this ummah has faced in a way that is unprecedented. The speaker just before me spoke about Bosnia and the massacre in Bosnia. It's 30 years. It's the 30-year anniversary of that genocide that happened here in Europe. Srebrenica was here in Europe, where thousands of men were rounded up and killed. We had a horrific situation with civilians being killed, a lot of women being dishonored. This was the greatest calamity in Europe since World War II. And what's interesting, a lot of people don't recognize what happened in Bosnia was directly linked to atheism, was directly linked to the Soviet Union. Now, when we think of atheism, we think of it as an abstract ideology. But it is more than an abstract ideology. It is something that has facilitated even empires. Consider the 20th century. The 20th century had a huge empire, a strong, powerful economic system, the Soviet Union. Now, the states within that union, they were part of this union by force. Ukraine, Poland, Albania. We also had Yugoslavia, from which we have the modern day states of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia. We also had, a lot of people don't recognize this, Central Asia, the heartland of Islam, the land of Imam Bukhari. Now, during the occupation, and when we speak about occupation, we normally refer to the occupation that's happening in Palestine. But there was an occupation of the heartlands of the Muslims in Central Asia in particular, leaving aside the former territories of the Ottomans in Europe, which were also under the brutal occupation of the Soviet Union. What happened in Central Asia? I want you to consider something. We right now are in a holy place. We are in a mosque. The mosque is the symbol of the Muslim civilization. The Muslim civilization is represented by houses of worship, houses in which Allah's name is glorified. And the Soviet Union worked to dismantle, destroy, and eradicate mosques throughout Central Asia, to the point that ancient mosques were demolished, imams were executed, women had their hijabs forcibly removed. The Muslims took the Quran and they hid it in walls. They hid it in many different places because of the Soviet terror. And this was a terror that was primarily led by their atheistic outlook. A lot of people today, they don't recognize that, when we think of militant Christianity, we think of the Crusades, or we think of Christian Zionism. When we think of militant Judaism, what do we think of? An extremist version, a political ideology known as Zionism. When we think of extremist Muslims, then you would have groups like ISIS. You would have people that you can subscribe each ideology to. Likewise, Atheism, when it had power, the communist states, they applied state atheism, and they applied this to the religious minorities, to the Muslims, the Christians and the Jews. They caused Muslims to be uprooted from their lands. The Chechens were actually sent to Siberia. A lot of people don't know this. Muslims in Albania were executed, imams were executed, and hardly any mosques were left in Bukhara. Bukhara is where? It's the land of Imam Bukhari. Imagine in the land of Imam Bukhari, the disbelieving atheists were in charge and they were controlling everything. And they were teaching people there is no God. They were teaching people there is no hereafter. They were teaching people there is no such thing as God or design or morality. All of these things fundamentally, they were uprooting from society. So we as Muslims here comfortably in the 21st century, we shouldn't have this historical amnesia. This is something very recent, just a few decades ago this was happening. Now by Allah's mercy, it was the Muslims who humiliated and defeated and decisively made the Soviet Union a footnote in our glorious history. It was the Muslims of Afghanistan that stood up and they defended their deen, because the Soviets were trying to apply the same thing to Afghanistan that they had applied to Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, all of these other countries in Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. So the fact is, Islam as a religion, it prevailed in the end, just like it prevailed with the Mongols. The Mongols came in, they destroyed the Muslim world, but they were eventually conquered. Likewise, there's a resurgence of Islam. However, here in Europe, in the early 21st century, after the 9/11 attacks, there was an incredibly fast movement of atheism that had risen up again. Just like the atheists of the previous century, the 20th century, they believe in their religion, they believe in their ideology, and they believe this should be prevailing upon Islam in particular. They wrote books like God is Not Great. When we pray, what do we say? We say Allahu Akbar. We say Allahu Akbar. They wrote books like God is Not Great. They wrote books like The God Delusion, that the idea of God is a delusion. Just like the militant atheists of the Soviet Union, who were known as the League of Militant Atheists, these new atheists openly stated their animosity towards Islam. Openly spoke about potentially a preemptive nuclear strike on Mecca. Imagine that. They, in their writings, people like Sam Harris, they openly are speaking about these things. Likewise, you had a very vocal journalist here in the UK. He was somebody who had a huge following. And this is before the days of social media. He is just a known figure in media, Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens said, the ones fighting for atheism, the ones fighting for secularism rather, is us, as in the new atheists, and the American army in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he was pro-war. He was debating for the intervention in Iraq. And the intervention in Iraq led to the deaths of over 1 million Muslims, and then led to the destabilization of that region. So we are talking about an ideology. When we're speaking about the movement which is known as New Atheism, which began after 9/11, we're talking about something that affected every domain of Muslim life, even in Britain, even here in Britain. So this particular book that I've come here today to speak about is called Dawkins Deselected. Now, Richard Dawkins is a famous evolutionary biologist. He's the one that wrote the book, The God Delusion. He's the one who popularized the new atheist movement. He's the one who, even today, as Gaza is burning, as Palestinians are starving, as our brothers and sisters are losing their limbs, even in this situation, he is mocking Islam. Because remember, for a genocide to take place, there has to be a level of dehumanization. And new atheists, before and now, today, they want to dehumanize Muslims. They can't do it in the open way that the Nazis were doing against the Jewish communities, but they'll do it in other ways. So, during the holiest day in the Islamic calendar, on the day of Hajj, on the day of Arafah, the day in which we are all worshipping Allah and the Muslims are in that holy place, there is a genocide happening in Palestine. What does Richard Dawkins, the head of this movement, decide to do? He decides to go on Twitter, where he has a massive following, and take a picture of the Kaaba and stick it on there and say, Islam is a mental infection. This is dehumanization. And they want to do this. So what we need to do is we need to understand what is the history of this movement, what are the objectives of this movement, how can we refute this movement, and what is the future of this movement, and how is it going to impact us here in Britain and across the world. Okay, so the first thing I want to highlight is their movement is predicated on some intellectual arguments. They believe them to be intellectual rather. They've couched it in this intellectualization framework that, they've intellectualized certain things which for us are quite absurd. So they put forward arguments for why there is no God. They put forward arguments for why God doesn't make sense and God is a delusion. The second thing that they do is they attack the moral framework of Islam. They attack the moral framework of God in particular and religions in general, but Islam is their primary goal. Islam is their primary target. And remember, things don't have to pan out with direct violence. As Sam Harris writes, the situation of the Muslims in Europe should be made more difficult. Sam Harris or another atheist, Douglas Murray, one of them said this, right? The situation of the Muslims should be made more difficult across the board. So the thing is, if you look at how Muslims are stopped in airports, or how Muslims may not get planning with permission for when they're building a mosque, when Muslims have the far right to try and antagonize their communities as they did last year. We had a dawah table up north where all they were doing was they were just handing out Quran and speaking to people about Islam, and the far right came and attacked it and threw everything on the floor, including, Islamic books. Why do they want to do this? Because fundamentally they see Islam as the enemy. So we need to understand why they think what they think and how to actually refute them. So I've only actually got 2 copies here. The rest you guys can actually order from Amazon. And what I would recommend is you can get this for free. You don't need to buy this. You can get this for free, and the QR code is somewhere, and Brother Hassan is going to put it up inshallah. So you can download this for free and you can read it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief explanation of each chapter, and there's actually 8 chapters. And these chapters are based upon everything that I just said previously about their ideology, about their past, about their future, about how they interact with us, and so on and so forth. So the first chapter is on the origins of the new atheist movement. So what I do in this chapter, I explain how did this begin? What is the genesis of this? And interestingly, the genesis of this is not just linked to 9/11. It goes back many decades before that. It goes back generally to the decline of religion here in Europe. During the Victorian era, we had a decline in religion and an increase in secularization. Then after World War II, we had a massive liberalization movement, and throughout Europe you had this rejection of religion, and you had humanistic values and liberal values and scientism, this idea that science is the only way of looking at the world, being pushed. And this project continued. It continued in the academic world and it continued in popular culture. So for the first time here in Europe, figures which were held in high regard, like Jesus, peace be upon him, Isa alayhi salam, they could be openly mocked. We had a show here in the UK, The Life of Brian. They were able to, in this show, desensitize people to the mockery of holy figures. Likewise today, you will find, when you go to Netflix, you will find a continuous infusion of atheistic ideas, evolutionary Darwinian ideas, liberal ideas, scientific ideas. These egalitarian supposed ideas being pushed through these mediums. And you'd find the same in the education system. And you'd find the same in universities. And you'd find the same in documentaries. You can go today and see even children's programs. They have an infusion of these ideas. You don't even have to go to something really out there like some random movie that no one knows about. We're talking here about basic things like Superman. In Superman, I saw a clip where they were speaking about Darwinism, Darwinian evolution. What does that have to do with Superman, this comic book? What are they trying to project? What are they trying to project to people? Think of another program that a lot of children watch, Young Sheldon. Smart child, atheist. Parents, dumb and religious. Society, religious and dumb. And he's the one who doesn't believe in God and he's supposedly smart. Likewise, this movement was there in academia. The actual name of this movement, this atheistic lens, this was formerly known as logical positivism. Logical positivism. The idea was that if you cannot verify something using your senses, your eyes, your ears, your sense of smell, taste, if something is not within time, space, matter, it doesn't exist. The basic idea was everything should be broken down to what is empirical, what we can verify physically, or certain mathematical truths. That's it. So this movement started off in the 1920s in Vienna. It was known as the Vienna Circle. By the 1970s and 80s, it was dead for lots of reasons. Firstly, it doesn't make sense to say the only things that we can believe in are those things which are physical and real. Do we believe in the existence of Genghis Khan? Yes, we do. Can we verify that existence using the scientific method? No, we cannot. We don't know where he's buried. We don't know what his genetic makeup is. Likewise, the mere fact that I have a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather going back 7 generations, that's something logical. And science requires logic, requires mathematics. Mathematics and logic cannot be verified using the scientific method. Likewise, morality. We believe in right and wrong. We believe a genocide's happening, which is wrong. We believe in the existence of wrong, and we believe in the duty, the imperative of stopping the wrong things. This cannot be verified using the scientific method. Likewise, we believe in metaphysics. We believe there's consciousness. You are conscious, I am conscious. The brain is simply not something that generates the mind. The mind cannot simply be broken down to the brain. We're not zombies, we're not robots. This is again something that is not scientific, but it's rational to believe in. There's many beliefs which are rational, which are not scientific. Even the idea that science is the only root of knowledge, that statement itself cannot be scientifically proven. So logical positivism died. It died by the 1970s and 80s. However, new atheism rose up And it used the same sort of arguments that the logical positivists used, even though they were dead by then, philosophically totally gone. And they again pushed out these ideas. So I want to highlight something really important about this. Atheist academics, there's a difference between the militant atheist and a general atheist. Atheist academics actually called these people out. They actually said, what you're saying does not make any sense. For example, the famous atheist philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, although he himself believes in Darwinism, he refuted Richard Dawkins because he thought the ideas that he is pushing out don't actually make any sense. He actually said, Dawkins makes me embarrassed to be an atheist because of the arguments that he's putting forward. So people like Ruse, for this book, I actually included my interviews with them. Ruse passed away last year, and last year I interviewed him and I actually asked him about Richard Dawkins, because Richard Dawkins called him basically a coward. He compared him to Neville Chamberlain, you know, the Prime Minister before Churchill who appeased Hitler. He said, for us, basically evolutionists, this is who Michael Ruse is. He's like an appeaser, he's like a coward. And Ruse basically replied, look, this guy wouldn't pass a basic philosophy course. This guy doesn't know what he's basically talking about, in other words, right? So it's not just the case that other atheists didn't call them out, they did call them out. Now, scientism as a philosophy, as an ideology, turned out to be false. So that's what chapter 2 is about. Chapter 1, like I said, is about the origin of the movement. Chapter 3, the famous book, The God Delusion. What I do in this chapter is I take the famous refutations of the central argument that Richard Dawkins puts in that book, and I compile them together. And what I did is I actually showed how even atheist academics have refuted his points here. You don't even have to be a believer. Although there is an atheistic bias. If you're an atheist, you're more likely to be biased towards the atheistic worldview. If you're a believer, you're more likely to be biased towards a believing worldview. That's just a brute fact. But you have a situation here where even the colleagues of Richard Dawkins at Oxford University, even some of them called him out for this. They said this doesn't actually make any sense, the point he's making. So in the central argument, the argument he basically makes is this. He makes an argument against the existence of God using biology. That's the central argument. And I'm going to summarize the argument. The argument he makes is this. All around us, this beautiful architecture that we see in nature, this architecture, this beauty, this complexity, this diversity, this elegant engineering, this design is all an illusion. It's all an illusion. Design is an illusion. And the reason it's an illusion is because we have discovered a process known as Darwinian evolution. So that's his first point. His first major point that he's not only made in this book, he's made this point for many, many years. He says, look, design looks like design, but it's not really design. It's an illusion of design. The second major point he makes is, design raises the problem of who designed the designer. Therefore, there's no God. As in, therefore, you can't infer God, right? That's his probabilistic argument. The problem is with these two premises, both of them don't hold water. The first premise, that design is an illusion, this premise itself is not a scientific premise. It's a belief he has. And he doesn't justify the belief. He merely states it. And he's written absurd things. He's said that design that you see in nature is so good, it helps us with our research. He says design in nature is so good that it's almost indistinguishable from intentional design. So the design of the smartphone and the brain They both may look immensely complex, with all of these cells working together from our biochemical level to our neurological level to our anatomy to our physiology to our psychology to our linguistics. It's all amazing, but do you know what? It's an illusion of design. But the problem with that is that's a belief. That's not something that science says. That's something you are coloring into the scientific work. And this is another problem. A lot of people cannot tell the difference between a statement of a scientist and actually science itself. Because sometimes scientists use the status of science to make statements which are not scientific statements. They're ideological statements or moral statements or ethical statements or theological statements. And these statements should not be given the same weight as the scientific work that they're involved in. Why is Richard Dawkins writing a book called River Out of Eden, A Darwinian View of Life? He's making a biryani of biology and philosophy and theology and a whole bunch of other topics that he's simply not qualified in. And he presents it as if it's a scientific worldview, when it's simply his worldview, which is quite convoluted and confused. So the central argument fails because the first major premise, which is that design is an illusion, it has not been established. Secondly, if you want to claim design is an illusion, you have to provide a solid argument for it philosophically. And what would that argument look like? At best, that argument would be probabilistic. And even in terms of probabilities, it would still heavily rely upon the Darwinian mechanism. But the Darwinian mechanism at best shows the power of a particular naturalistic process if it's true. It doesn't do away with the supposed illusion of design. The other point that he made is we cannot infer from designer because it raises a bigger problem of who designed the designer. This is why he says the designer is blind. And he has this idea of the blind watchmaker. The issue here is, if I infer from this microphone here that behind this microphone there must have been a designer, and then someone says, but who designed that designer? It doesn't get rid of the initial inference from design to designer. It simply raises another question, which is where did the designer come from? But it doesn't deny this particular point. If we questioned like that, it would be incoherent. These are two separate questions. Does this have a design? Where did the designer come from? Two different questions. So what he's doing is, he is misunderstanding the inference of design, the way the design argument is actually made. Secondly, the best explanation, if design is the best explanation, or if something else is the best explanation in philosophy or science or history or sociology or criminology or psychology, the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. And this is something which his colleague at Oxford University, the philosopher Daniel Kame, who actually called him a coward because he refused to debate William Lane Craig when they actually were supposed to have a debate at Oxford University, he said, it's a basic point. You cannot say you can't accept this inference because that's the best explanation. That's not the way that science works. That's not the way that philosophy works. So the central argument, he tries to use that flawed logic to the universe. He tries to apply it to the universe and says, like biological design is an illusion, the design of the universe is illusory. The problem is, if you failed at the first hurdle, you can't jump further. Another issue he fails to reconcile with is the origin of life. Darwin never dealt with the origin of life. He dealt with the development of life. He assumed life is there. So the origin of species does not literally mean the origin of species. It means the development of species from other species. Francis Crick, very famous biologist, atheist biologist, in Cambridge, he alongside Watson discovered the structure of DNA. You know that famous double helix? You see the DNA design everywhere. He discovered that in the 1950s and he won the Nobel Prize. Now, he was an atheist, he was a Darwinist, he was an evolutionist. He could not explain the immense complexity of what he was seeing in front of him, the DNA. He could not explain this. It's extremely difficult to explain this level of design. So in his book, Life Itself, he came up with the theory. And the theory was called directed panspermia. Okay? That's another way of him making a theory which is quite absurd sound scientific. Directed panspermia means this: aliens designed life and seeded it on this planet using rockets. Now you may think, come on brother, you've had some crack, you've had some cart, you've had something, brother, here, yeah? You've been smoking something, yeah? Like, but this is literally their answer. Their answer was, okay, we cannot explain this complexity, this diversity, this immense elegant engineering, this design, this architecture, we cannot explain it, so we will refer to potentially this coming through extraterrestrial beings. Richard Dawkins was asked about this question about the origin of life in a documentary known as No Intelligence Allowed, which you can watch on YouTube. It's quite an interesting documentary. And in this documentary, when someone says to him, yeah, but what about the origin of life? What about, this thing? He said, well, the origin of life, it could have been intelligently designed by extraterrestrial beings in another part of the universe. Again, Dawkins is referring to the theory of directed panspermia from Francis Crick. So the reporter, the interviewer, asked him a very basic question, because no one has a monopoly on thinking. Don't let any of these Darwinists or atheists or militant skeptic thinkers tell you you're not allowed to think. We're going to tell you what to think because we've thought of it for you. You're too inferior to make up your own mind. No, we have a rational mind, we have the right to ask. So the reporter asked him, okay, so if we came from rockets that were seeded on this planet through extraterrestrial beings from another civilization in another part of the universe, where did those people come from? Where did the aliens come from? And his answer, brace yourself, through Darwinism. Thank you for that very underwhelming answer, Mr. Dawkins. So what he's basically saying is, life developed through Darwinism on this planet, but we can't explain the origin of life. Where did that come from? That came from another set of aliens. Where did they come from? They evolved through Darwinism, but Darwinism doesn't deal with the origin of life. So what was the origin of life for those aliens? You're simply kicking the can down the road. But he doesn't realize it. But when it comes to God, they will keep asking, who made that, who made that, who made that? But when it comes to their own philosophy, they know there has to be a first cause. They know there has to be a primary reason for why everything exists. They know rather than nothing, something always has to have existed. If nothing was always there, then nothing would be there. Right? So, when it comes to the central argument, it totally and utterly fails. And the next chapter is on evolution and God. So what I do in this chapter is I go deep into biological evolution, into Darwinism, into neo-Darwinism, into whatever you want to call it. I go into that and I basically show, actually before speaking about today, what I show is even Darwin himself did not believe biology led to atheism. Dawkins is not only misrepresenting science and philosophy, he's misrepresenting Darwin himself. Darwin was not a militant atheist. Darwin was never an atheist. Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. He was a deist. A deist is someone who believes in God but doesn't believe in religion. When his friend Charles Kingsley wrote him a letter and said, If God created one origin of life and it evolved into all these different organisms, all these different species, or if God created all species individually, both of these would be just as equal for God, just as noble for God. Something like this, which is a very religious, theological statement of Kingsley. Darwin took that letter from his friend Charles Kingsley, who was a believing evolutionist, and he stuck it in the second edition of The Origin of Species. Does that sound like an atheist to you? He's not. When he saw people are using his works to promote atheism, he said, I never intended to write atheistically. He openly stated you can be a theist and an evolutionist. He pointed towards his friend Asa Gray in America, who's an evolutionist and a theist. So Darwin understood this. Why is it that Darwin is misrepresented? We may disagree with Darwin's ideas, but at least don't misrepresent him. He never said that. Likewise, atheist philosophers today, the ones who are not militantly new atheistic, and then they would agree with Dawkins, you will find many philosophers saying, of course evolutionary theory does not undermine the existence of God, in the same way Newtonian theory doesn't, or in the same way string theory doesn't. None of these theories do. So on evolution and God, what I basically do is I decisively, inshallah, show historically, philosophically, and scientifically, Darwinism does not undermine the existence of God, even if Darwinism was true. If Darwinism is true is another matter, and I have another book alongside Salman Butt called The Death of Neo-Darwinism. And in that, we delve into if Darwinism is actually true. Okay, the next chapter is on atheism and morality. That's chapter 5, and we have 8 chapters, so there's just 4 more I'm going to summarize. On atheism and morality. Now, what atheists did after 9/11, they said the worst of the religions is the Islamic religion, the Muslim religions. Muslims are backwards, Muslims are terrorists, Muslims oppress women, Muslims do this. We are the champions of human rights. We speak up for humanism, for liberalism, for egalitarianism. Their entire argument is fundamentally a moral argument. They believe in right and wrong. But the problem is, they also believe in scientism, which is you can only stick with science. Now, scientism is different to science. Science is what we all do and we all love. Scientism is an ideology, which is science is the only method of knowledge. And that's obviously wrong. You cannot put right and wrong in a test tube. You cannot observe it through a telescope. Right and wrong scientifically does not exist. So what is this idea of we believe in right and wrong in human rights and morals and ethics and civilization and humanity and civility? What is this? It doesn't make any sense. At least be more coherent, right? So on atheism and morality, what Dawkins does, he tries to justify the existence of morality using some key evolutionary ideas. One of the ideas is kin selection, one of the ideas is reciprocal altruism. So the ideas are very simple. We are good to each other because if you scratch someone's back, they're going to scratch your back, or you're good to your children because they carry your genetic material. But these arguments are quite vacuous. These arguments are quite feeble and weak. They fumble in the face of facts. These arguments are not even coherent if you leave them on their own. But even if you accept them at face value, they are recalcitrant facts, counterfactuals to those ideas. We are good to people without wanting something back. We donate to a charity, and that charity, the recipient, is not going to help me to maximize my evolutionary fitness because they don't know who I am and I don't know who they are. Even atheistic philosophers like David Stove, they wrote about this in a book called Darwinian Fairy Tales. And what he basically said is, why do we pay tax for hospitals? That's the survival of the unfittest. How does any of this make any sense? So what he basically argues, and others have argued, is that altruism, empathy, sympathy, these basic human qualities cannot be explained under Darwinism. He considers Darwinism a slander upon human beings. So atheism and morality doesn't work. What I do in the next chapter is even worse against the atheistic worldview, which is on atheism and violence. Forget the abstract ideas of if atheists can justify morality. They cannot. Have they been moral when they had power? No, they were not moral. They were the worst oppressors in human history. Millions of people died under communism. Some estimates have gone up to 100 million people died. No religion has killed that many people as much as the atheists have, the militant atheists have. And today, as the genocide is happening to our brothers and sisters in Palestine, one of the main proponents of atheism, Sam Harris, he is justifying the actions of the Zionist state against the Palestinians. Now I want you to understand something very odd. The new atheists say religion is evil. This is the perfect time for them to say the Israelis, the Zionists, are calling Palestinians animals, calling the Palestinians Amalekites, from the biblical reference of the people that were wiped out, that were genocided. This is the perfect time for the new atheists to say, look at the violence religion causes. Look at the violent Zionists. Look at these extremists killing these innocent people. It's the perfect example. But rather than defend them and use an argument in their favor, they're either silent or complicit. They either support the Zionist state or they're muted. In the case of Sam Harris, open support for the Zionist state, open arguments for their actions, and justification and excuses. And he does this as an atheist. Why? Because for them, Islam is the greatest evil. Richard Dawkins a few years ago, and this is, remember, at the height of the war on terror, 1 million people have died in Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims are dead all across the world because of this war on terror. Afghanistan, how many people died? Somalia, how many people died? Yemen, how many people died? Syria, how many people died? Lebanon, how many people died? Palestine, how many people died? The Israelis used the war on terror to do what they're doing today. What does Richard Dawkins say? Islam is like Nazism. And he says, I do not need to read Mein Kampf to know that it's evil. Likewise, I don't need to read the Quran to know that it's evil. While the Muslims are being butchered, he is dehumanizing Muslims. And this is why in this chapter what I basically do is I show how they are violent in their ideology. The only difference between them and the League of Militant Atheists from the Soviet Union is they don't have political power. What they do have is the power of oration, the power of public speaking, the power of media. And they use that to openly support the people who are killing Muslims, while they're supposed to be believers in humanism and liberalism and human rights and ethics and all this stuff. I actually reference in this chapter a study at King's College in which they looked at the narrative of the new atheists and how it dovetails with the war on terror, and how these new atheists justify the actions of Western imperialism. And this is also important because Darwin's ideas were used to justify British imperialism. A lot of people don't know that. British imperialism, a lot of the people here, they would be from India, Pakistan, or Somalia, or the Middle East. You have faced British imperialism, or your ancestors did at least. The British imperialists, their actions were being justified by Darwin. Darwin wrote in The Descent of Man that in the future time, the future centuries, this will continue because the Caucasian race he saw was the dominant race. And by the way, this is a funny side point I'm going to make. He didn't just say white people are superior to brown people or black people. Black people for him were the most inferior. According to him, the white people were not all equal. They were not all equal. Amongst the white people, amongst the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Greek and the German and the French and the English and the Scottish and the Irish, of course, there was a hierarchy. And the hierarchy was that the British were superior to the Portuguese and the French and the German and the Spanish and the Greek. Why? Oh, in Darwin's words, they are superior because they are better at what? Imperialism, colonization. And what were the British doing at this time? Genociding the natives. Famine in India, famine in Australia, famine and killing and raping and destruction of the Europeans in Africa, in Congo, in Latin America, in North America, what was happening to the natives. So is it just a coincidence, Mr. Darwin, that the race you preach is the highest, happens to be the same race that you happen to belong to? Is that just a historical coincidence? Is it also a coincidence that the people who are most likely to believe in this theory of Darwinism happen to be the same race that the theory purports are the most intelligent? Is that just a coincidence, or is that just a self-serving nature of your theory? So the second last chapter, chapter 7, what I basically do, I go on to the fragmentation of New Atheism. New Atheism actually started ripping apart around the year 2012 to the year 2001. It took off, or rather that was the genesis of it. 2012 it started going down. One of the causes was that the feminists broke away from them. The feminists broke away from them because the feminists said, you're sexist, you believe in patriarchy, you believe in this, you believe in that, because they saw the leaders of the New Atheists were white men. Aggressive men. They said, we're not represented in this movement. And even the feminist philosophers started getting involved. Now this is a historical battle because Darwin did not think much of women. He considered the mind of a woman in between a child and a savage. He said, if you take a list of all of the fields in human inquiry, and in his time the fields were limited, right? So we're talking about maths and poetry and science, and today we have much more. We have psychology, we have sociology, we have history, we have biology, chemistry, physics, breaking down into bioinformatics and quantum. Like literally he said, if you take a field of men and women and you list this field with the pioneers, with the forerunners, with the leaders, you would find men would come up on top. So he basically thought of women as inferior. And today, evolutionary psychologists, people who believe in Darwinism, they say patriarchy, toxic masculinity, gender roles, all of the things the feminists complain about, this is biological inheritance to help us survive and reproduce. They give evolutionary arguments for them. So the feminists broke away from these people. Even though they didn't break away from atheism, they broke away from the new atheist movement. The next breakup was with the trans movement. Wokeism, trans rights. They basically argued trans rights is not something we believe in, and there was a massive breakup. One of the leaders of that sort of way of thinking in the new atheist movement was Matt Dillahunty. He broke away from Richard Dawkins. Kufr is never consistent. Disbelief is never consistent. It's internally incoherent. There's inconsistencies. There's intertensions. So it started ripping apart. The feminists started ripping away. The trans wokeism people started ripping away. And today you just have embers left of it. You just have little pockets left of it. And the death blow to atheism, new atheism, came from the last chapter, which is spirituality. So I write on death, meaning, and spirituality. The new atheists realize if we're not spiritual, we're going to lose the masses. The one who realized this was Sam Harris. He wrote a book called Waking Up, Spirituality Without God. and he argued you can be spiritual without God. He said Islam misuses spirituality. He didn't say Islam is not spiritual. He actually wrote about adhkar, about dhikr. He actually wrote about the Quranic recitation and how it made him feel. He said Islam misuses the ecstasy of spirituality for suicide bombing and conquest. So he believes in spirituality, not just the Islamic version of it. So what I do here is I totally demolish the idea that you can be an atheist and be spiritual, because again, how does that fit with science? Your idea of scientism. How does it fit with atheism? How does it fit with the idea there is no soul? So what I do, not soul, with something immaterial. So what I basically do is I show how spirituality will always win, and you have to have God for spirituality. You cannot have spirituality without God. And what I end upon is this thirst of spirituality, it will always come up. Just like the Mongols left Central Asia and they had the Yasa code and they tried to conquer the Muslim world conquered them, the Yasa got replaced by the Sharia and the Mongols became Muslim. Likewise, the communist states fell and Islam rose up. Islam is back in Central Asia, Islam is back in Afghanistan, Islam is back in Bosnia, Islam is back in Albania, Islam is back in Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, Tatarstan. Islam is back in all those places, because faith will always come back up. The more you push it down, the more it will spring up. So they lost. And what I end upon is the Quranic verse, towards your Lord direct your longing. For me, I needed a verse to end this book on. And the verse I ended it on is towards your Lord direct your longing, because the human being, everything they have, it will not give them happiness unless they have a relationship with God, because that is why they were created. This relationship with Allah is why they were created. If they don't have this relationship with Allah, they will never be fulfilled. And this is why, my dear brothers and sisters, atheism failed as a movement, because it failed to provide an adequate response for the need of spirituality, which is a need human beings have, which is greater than food and water and shelter and safety. It's the need of meaning and purpose. And this is why the Palestinians are living on. The Palestinians are striving, like the Bosnians did, like the Muslims did against the Quraysh at the Battle of Khandaq. Islam prevails under pressure. Atheism has no mechanism. Imagine if the people of Gaza were atheists and they were not Muslims. They would have given up by now. They would have all committed suicide by now. It's faith that makes us win. It is not these ideologies. And like I began off with when I was speaking about the history that the Muslim world has faced calamities in the past, and it's a good way of ending the lecture as well. We faced the Qurayshi tribes came together alongside the other Mushrik tribes at the Battle of Khandaq, the confederation. They came. We were outnumbered and outmanned. We were outgunned. Yet Islam prevailed. It prevailed over them, prevailed over the Persians, prevailed over the Romans, prevailed over the Mongols, prevailed over the colonizers, prevailed over the Crusaders, and inshallah will prevail over the Zionist state as well, and any other movement that's going to come, whether it's going to be scientism, Darwinism, humanism, liberalism, whatever it is. Islam came to dominate them all. So the fact is, in our lifetime, we are seeing the death of new atheism, we're seeing the fall of new atheism, and any other challenges that the 21st and the 22nd century is going to bring, Islam is going to prevail over them as well. And to end upon, the Prophet, peace be upon him, taught us, Islam is to prevail, not to be prevailed over. Everything good I've said is from Allah, every mistake is from myself. Jazakallah khair for listening, and we'll start with the Q&A now, inshallah.